All right, guys. I think I figured it out. I got to convert everything to an MP4 and load it up to YouTube and then share it publicly and then send you a link to the YouTube channel on Schoology. Now, if you dwell on the YouTube channel, you might see some other videos that I haven't assigned to you, but they will be beneficial um, come next spring and summer. The YouTube channel and those recorded lessons came about because of the COVID pandemic. So I did a lot of live recorded uh, video lab demonstrations of, in particular, spine and skull positioning. So the spine positioning will be happening in March. And if you remember, in March of 2020, week number 2, I think that's when they shut everything down. And so that's when I had to start doing recorded position. We couldn't hold live laboratory because of the pandemic. So the best that I could do was just do a video demonstration of what does it look like to perform the positions, and that's what passed for procedures class uh, in the early days of the pandemic. So we still have those videos. You're free to watch those and use those as additional resource. And it looks like this is also going to be the new conduit for recorded lectures because the PowerPoint show format is not working with Schoology. It doesn't play. So anyway, let's get into today's. I think this comes up at the end of week 2, maybe beginning of week 3. And this is your Bouchon textbook, Stuart Carlisle Bouchon. It's a light blue textbook. It's the textbook we're going to be using for physics. It says 12th edition Radiologic Science for Technologists, and it's got a picture of surgery being performed on the front cover, okay? Physics, biology, and protection. So I have to extract like a summation of the chapter 15 content of Bouchon. Mr. Shepard will cover that in greater detail next summer, but I want to give you a crash course in exposure technique, KVP and mass and exposure index and all the things happening at the control panel that determine the power settings for the exposure as we set the exposure off. So I'm going to give you an idea of how is that affecting the beam, and then how is that helping us to capture the patient's anatomy and make a representation of it on the radiograph. So let's get into it. Okay. Now, we're not going to dive deep, so if you jump into Bouchon and start reading and getting confused, maybe understand that this is just an introduction. We're just kind of skimming the surface and the big picture ideas. The deep dive is, again, Mr. Shepard next summer, okay? So I'm going to talk about various imaging technologies, and really it's a difference in image receptors. The X-ray tube has basically been in its current form since I would say the late 1930s, right? That's the last significant technological innovation to the actual X-ray tube itself. What has continued to improve is how do we catch the X radiation, and the device that we call the image receptor used to be screen film technology, physical pieces of film that we would have to develop and process. But now we've created an electronic mechanism, either direct or indirectly, of capturing the X radiation. Okay. Now, KVP and mass, those are actually electricity terms. KVP stands for kilovoltage peak. So voltage is part of electricity. It's a way to describe electricity. And mass, with a capital A in the middle, stands for milliamperage times seconds. So milliamperage is a measure of current, and then seconds is a measure of exposure time, okay? And so mass, we combine those because both the length of the exposure and the amount of current we pass through the X-ray tube, both of those determine the same thing, which is the number of photons that are in our beam. And so we don't think about exposure. There's sometimes we think about exposure time is separate from tube current, but it's also often convenient of thinking about mass as an individual property, a combined property of the X-ray beam. Okay? Exposure time is also like when we're talking about controlling motion, exposure time is its own factor, but mass is also a factor. Mass is a factor that affects dose. Exposure time by itself is a factor that affects both dose and motion on the image. Okay, and motion actually detracts from the information. Everything gets blurry if there's motion on the image, and the image is less diagnostic. So effects of part thickness, I talked a little bit about that yesterday when I was first introducing the control panel. Part composition, how much of the tissue is bone versus how much of the tissue is soft tissue, versus is it a chest x-ray? Is most of the tissue really air-filled alveoli? Okay, so all that makes a difference in penetrability. Okay, pathology. Is it a tumor? Because tumors are usually more dense than the equivalent healthy tissue. And so, in effect, thickness is kind of, not really thickness, but tissue composition. The tissue density is increasing with tumors being present. Okay? Does the patient have pneumonia? Well, the lungs are typically filled with air, but in the case of pneumonia, the bottoms of the lungs are starting to fill with water and mucus. Okay, and so that's harder to penetrate with an X-ray than air is. Okay, the molecules are closer together. There's been again a thickening of the tissue, so to speak, or an increase in the density of the tissue, mass per unit volume type density, and so therefore more X-rays are going to be absorbed than if it was just air-filled alveoli. We're hopeful that you're going to start feeling comfortable with selecting technical factors. After I explain to you what does changing each technical factor really accomplish, and this will be our first shallow dive into what each technical factor does. Mr. Shepard will take a deep dive with that next summer. And then, of course, discussing technique really matters when we're talking about critiquing images for quality. Okay, is there motion? Well, is the patient under 5 and there's motion? Okay, well, I told you every 2-year-old X-ray is really a wrestling match, right? So if there's motion, how long is your exposure time running? Okay, because if it's only 3/1000ths of a second, nothing is moving. That's the thing about small fragments of time for an exposure time. With a rapid exposure, and people who study film photography know this, who have film photography as a hobby, they understand a quick shutter time, and you're only letting light through in a very, very small fraction of a window of time, so it's like the earth stands still. So people who were taking pictures of butterflies or hummingbirds, they know that they have to have a quick shutter speed, a short exposure time that is, in order to remove blur and capture that flying creature as if they're hovering in the air and they're frozen in place. Okay, we can do the same thing with a 2-year-old with an attitude problem. If he's wiggling all over the place, we don't have to hold him still for 2 seconds. We only have to hold him still for 2/100ths of a second. And that's possible. We can actually accomplish that. Okay. All right. So our image receptors are 5 types of image receptors. I think the book still mentions screen film, but we're going to forget about screen film. There's going to be primarily in the modern imaging center or hospital, There's going to be CR technology, computed radiography, which is also your photostimulable phosphor. Okay, so the CR cassette, the PSP, photostimulable phosphor, that's the same type of technology. That came onto the marketplace just as I was becoming an X-ray tech. So, I became an X-ray tech in 1998. All right. So mid 90s to late 90s, that's when PSPs became widespread use. I think the first iteration was actually debuted in the early 90s or late 80s, but it didn't get adopted widespread by hospitals. There was a little bit of lag in adopting the new technology and bringing in, because it's a capital purchase. You got to tear out your film processors and purchase new processing equipment for these new PSP systems. So it didn't make sense, especially if you have a smaller facility, it didn't make sense to overhaul your entire film system and adopt PSP until they started messing with the reimbursement rates. Okay? The DR detector, the latest iteration of digital X-ray technology, it stands for direct radiography. Both PSP and DR are considered digital radiography. Digital just means we're breaking up the big picture into an array or a matrix of very, very tiny picture elements called pixels. Okay, so any digital image that you see, whether it's an image on your cell phone camera or an image by a digital X-ray technology, the digital part of digital image means that it's actually a cluster of pixels, very, very small, jammed close together, and your eyeballs are fooled into thinking it's a continuous image. Okay? It's actually a collection of blocks. Anyone who played video games in the 80s, the original Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Mario Brothers 2, you understand that pixels are collections of blocks. That's not an Italian plumber. That's a stack of bricks with different colors that when you squint and lean back, it kind of resembles an Italian plumber named Mario. Okay. As the pixels get smaller and smaller and we get better and better graphics, and larger picture matrices, the resolution improves and the stack of blocks looks more and more like an Italian plumber or a chest radiograph, right? Okay. So there's two technologies at play in your DR detectors, the direct method and the indirect method. It's just mechanisms of how the X-ray is captured and turned into an electric signal. Okay, we'll do a deeper dive on that in the senior year. Your digital fluoroscope is basically the same technology as a DR detector, but it's got more robust processing electronics, and so it can do frame rates greater than 30 frames per second. Fooling, again, if you play video games, you understand that number. That's the threshold that fools a human eye into thinking that it's fluid motion picture, when it's actually just individual still pictures, but you push them past the human eye so rapidly, 30 pictures a second or greater, and it looks like motion picture. It looks like fluid motion. Okay. Your older fluoroscopic technology, that would be your image intensifier. Okay, and I will teach you about how an image intensifier works at the beginning of your senior year. In fact, that while you guys are learning this, the seniors will actually be learning the image intensifier in their imaging equipment class. All right, so here's our PSP cassette. It's still a cassette, and it still requires a second step in processing. Okay, so that's the advantage of the DR technology, is we don't have to carry the detector anywhere and start processing it. The data from a DR will automatically transmit to the processing software and begin processing automatically. Whereas CR technology, you capture the image and then you take the cassette to another machine called a CR reader or a CR processor, and you have to process and extract the image in a second step. So it's basically double the effort for each exposure on CR technology. The technologist has to go retrieve the cassette and process it, versus in DR technology, there is no retrieval of the detector. It starts downloading the data and processing it automatically without the tech having to do it. As soon as the exposure is over with, it's transmitting its data to the processing software on the computer. Okay. So this is our digital detector. Now, first generation stuff was actually hard tethered into a vertical bucky apparatus or integrated into a table. But they quickly found out that that means that they had to build 2 detectors for each machine, and then they reverted back to, okay, let's make it like a cassette where it's wireless and a single detector can be put together and just can be moved around by the technologist. We don't need a separate integrated detector arranged vertically and then another one arranged horizontally. We can just build a module wireless detector, and then it can be fit into a vertical holding stand or slipped into the table in a horizontal holding stand, okay, which would be the buckies that we used to use for the film cassettes. Okay. The fluoroscopic screen and then that cylinder above it that says Philips on it, that's an image intensifier. You don't see them very often anymore. This is the 1950s technology, but the fluoroscope with image intensifier, that was the dominant technology for motion picture X-rays from the late 1930s all the way up to just like 4 or 5 years ago. Okay. So an image intensifier, it basically looks like an electronic eye. It's actually the first iteration of an electronic eye. And it takes the X-ray and turns it into visible light going through the image intensifier. Okay. Now our fluoroscope, our motion picture X-ray fluoroscope, which this is one, has largely been upgraded to the new DR flat panel fluoroscope, which takes the DR plate and replaces the image intensifier with a flat DR panel, okay, like you saw on the previous slide. Now, grids. I mentioned grids briefly. When a body part gets too thick, we generate scatter radiation. The scatter radiation heads off in random directions. We can't predict those directions, and it actually detracts from useful information on our image receptor. And so we put in this grid that is essentially a filter for radiation that deviates from the geographic or the geometric norm. So you can see all the primary X-rays are basically traveling in an expanding triangle. Right? See how it's all symmetric, expanding red lines? But then there's a human body there, that oval shape, and some of the photons actually interact with the molecules and they produce a weaker photon that changes direction. That would be a scatter photon. The scatter photons that change direction, they don't actually convey any information, any useful information to the image receptor. Okay, the image receptor is that little rectangle at the very bottom of the picture. Okay, the grid is the thing with alternating blue stripes in it. The blue stripes are basically slots of lead oriented in the same geometry as the primary X-ray beam. And so the only way those slots of lead actually absorb any of the X-rays is if the X-rays change the direction, okay? And so that's what we call a focused grid. The grid is geometrically aligned with the path of the primary beam. So as long as those photons don't change direction, the grid will really ignore those. It's the photons that scatter and do change direction that end up being absorbed by the lead strips, okay? And it's just matching the geometry of the expanding beam, and that's how we get that done, okay? All right, using a different tool requires a different technique. What does that mean? Well, that means if you employ a grid, you usually have to compensate in your technique for the use of a grid. Now, usually the best way to go is to increase KVP. You increase KVP and you increase penetration power, okay? And then there's a little joke about tools. Those of you who have ever done any carpentry or woodworking might have heard the joke that the hammer is the universal tool, or sometimes simply called the universal. The universal tool, what are tools used for? To fix problems or to perform a certain task, okay? So that's the general definition of a tool. A universal tool would be a tool that fixes every problem, okay? And a hammer falls into that category because all you got to do is swing the hammer hard enough and it can fix literally everything, okay? You've got a picture that you want to hang on the wall, swing the hammer, okay? You have a picture that refuses to hang on the wall, swing the hammer really hard. Now you don't have a picture that refuses to hang on the wall. See how it works? Okay. So just a little woodworking or carpentry joke. A hammer fixes everything. You might have to start the problem solving over, but a hammer will fix it in the short term. Fix it real good. All right. Mass. Mass is a component of electricity. It stands for milliampere. Milliampere or milliamperage. Okay, it's a measurement of current. Now, what the heck is current? Well, current is the amount of electricity flowing in your circuit. It's literally how many electrons are rocketing past at this point, are rocketing from the plug to the wall and back. Okay, that's what amperage is. Okay, so you might have like blown a circuit, like if you run the coffee pot, the toaster, and the microwave all on the same line when you're like making your breakfast in the morning, okay? You might actually trip the breaker. That's because you're drawing too much current to a single kitchen circuit, okay? Typically, your kitchen circuits are rated for 60 amps, and it's your microwave that's the problem. Your toaster runs about 25 amps. Your coffee pot around 10 amps, okay? So if you're running those two, and just those two, your 60 amp circuit can handle it. It's when you add the microwave draws about 200 amps, okay? And so typically the microwave has to be, or all 60 amps. The microwave has to be on its own circuit. Otherwise, you're always going to be tripping your breaker. And that's why they make the ground fault circuit interrupter electrical outlets where the circuit breaker is actually embedded into the plug in the wall. It's the little button that you press to reset it. That's the ground fault circuit interrupter. You can avoid tripping your circuit by shifting your microwave to its own independent circuit. Okay? All of that is milliamperage, the amount of electricity running through the circuit. If you have too much electricity running through the circuit, the wire will actually overheat and catch fire, and you'll burn your house down. That's why you have a circuit breaker, so you don't burn your house down. Now, the other component of mass I mentioned already is exposure time. Okay, seconds are the standard measurement of time. Okay, seconds, minutes, hours, those kind of seconds. Now, typically when we're talking about X-ray exposures, we're talking about tenths and hundredths of seconds because we don't want motion on our X-ray. So the product of these two, X-ray tube current as milliamperage times exposure time, that is directly proportional to the number of photons that we're creating in the beam. Okay. Now, kilovoltage, it's essentially it's not really power like you would see in a tractor pull, but that's the closest iteration I can. Kilovoltage is we call it penetration power. We also call it electric potential or pull. It's the amount of force that the electrons are experiencing, literally. Okay, so why are the electrons flying through the wire? It's because we're pulling on those electrons with a certain force. That force is called voltage. Okay, the more forcefully we pull on the electrons across the X-ray tube, the more energetic our photons become. Okay, now we'll explain exactly why that's happening at the end of the physics course. Okay. For now, just understand kilovoltage means penetration power. If I'm under penetrating the body part because it's too thick, then I need to increase my kilovoltage. Okay. When do you increase mass? You would increase mass when you see quantum model. And hopefully you'll encounter quantum model in short order. Quantum model is basically too weak of a signal at your image receptor. Okay. So, how does an X-ray beam behave? Well, it's kind of like birdshot in a shotgun. The pellets, those are the number of pellets you have in your shotgun shell. That's like your mass. That's the number of photons in your beam. Okay. Then there's a wad. That's not really anything. The gunpowder, how much gunpowder do you have in your shotgun shell? Well, that's kind of like the kilovoltage. That's what's pushing the pellets out of the barrel. Okay. So firing off an X-ray exposure, the kVp is like the gunpowder in a shotgun shell. The mass is like the number of pellets you have in the load of the shotgun shell. Okay. Now the primer that kicks the thing off, that's the exposure switch. All right. So, and we use, you know, I'm not sure what your stance on guns are. It doesn't really matter. We're in Tennessee, and so that's why I lean into comparing an X-ray tube, or the X-ray beam, in fact, to the shotgun shell, is because most Tennesseans have encountered a shotgun shell. All right. So, in your advanced turkey hunting class or duck hunting class, you might have heard the terms straight bore or cylinder bore, full choke, modified choke, improved choke. Okay, so the choke actually is tapering. If you have a choke on your shotgun, it's actually tapering the barrel at the end and reducing its internal diameter. What this causes is the pellets to collapse, the stream of pellets to collapse on themselves, and so they don't expand coming out of the end of the barrel. It's a delay in the expansion, and you get a tighter grouping of the pellets. Okay. Typically, you're going to use full or modified choke for duck hunting, but you're going to use a straight bore for turkey hunting because ducks are smart and they get nervous faster. And so usually when you're shooting at the ducks, they're farther away. And so in order to hit the duck, you need the pellets to stay in a tighter cluster for longer. So you need a fuller modified choke. A turkey is stupid. If you make the mating call sounds of a turkey, it will walk up to within 5 yards of you before it figures out that you're not a turkey, you're actually a hunter. And so you can actually use a straight cylinder or an improved choke because you can lure the turkey in until it's inside like less than 10 yards. Okay? You'll never get a duck less than 10 yards. Ducks are too smart. Okay? Now, how does this correlate to an X-ray beam? Well, we have things called collimators that actually control how much the beam is spreading. It's a set of lead shutters. We've got some arranged horizontally and some arranged vertically, and they trim, that's what collimation means, they trim the beam in to the desired size, okay? Because you don't always want to shoot a full 14 by 17 field. All right, so another technical factor, it's really a geometric factor, but it's included in the technical factors, source to image receptor distance, okay? And what this diagram explains is, you intuitively understand it. This is called the inverse square law. As you get farther from a source of radiation, the radiation spreads out over a larger area, and so the intensity is reduced per unit area, okay? So you can see the first distance is called R, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 photon strikes in area A, okay? At 2R, the beam has quadrupled in size, and so now those same 8 photons are spread out over 4 times the amount of area, and so the dose, you only intersect 1/4 of the original intensity, okay? And then at 3R, it is 1/9 the original intensity. So if we had 9 photons in the first area A, by the time you're 3 times the distance away, you only get 1 of those 9 photons on average in the same area A, okay? There's 9 of those areas now. So what that means is the beam thins out as it travels further away from the X-ray tube, okay? Now, it can thin out too much such that we don't get enough photons hitting the image receptor, okay? Now, the antagonist to that is mass. So whenever you increase distance, you could increase mass to compensate, but that's going to increase patient dose, okay? And so we just need to be aware that intensity reduces. So as we use longer SIDs, typically our techniques are going to be higher mass or higher KV because the intensity is reducing as the beam spreads out and covers a larger surface area. And it does it naturally. The beam is shaped like, I think I told you this before, it's like an expanding pyramid. The longer it travels through the room, the bigger the base of the pyramid. And if you turn your head sideways, lean it to the left, you can see that expanding pyramid. All right, brightness. Brightness used to be controlled by KVP and mass, in particular mass. Okay? Brightness is now controlled by the system software. So you don't have to adjust KVP and mass if your image is too light or too dark. You can actually tweak that just like you do on Instagram. You know, the Instagram filters that you take a picture and it's like, oh, it looks good, but I think I could make it pop if I, you know, do some edge enhancement and maybe, you know, change the shadow colors and the highlight colors and just make everything look pretty. You can do the same, everything post-processing that you can do on Instagram, with the exception of changing the color scheme. You can also do that on an X-ray. So the software for that, the software function for that is called window width and window level. Window width changes your contrast. Window level changes your brightness or your darkness. Okay, if you increase window level, the image will get overall darker. If you decrease window level, the image will get brighter. Okay? If you increase window width, then your grayscale, there'll be more shades of gray on your image. If you decrease window width, your contrast will improve. That'll mean the differences in colors will be greater. You'll have a shorter grayscale on the image. Okay? All right, contrast. What is contrast? It really is, it's the way we see edges. The whole reason you can see black lines and white lines with gray bricks is because all those things are different colors. And now, which column of gray rectangles is darker? Is it the left gray rectangles or the right gray rectangles? Now you might say that the right gray rectangles are actually a lighter color gray. But actually, if you pause this video and cut the image out and put it in Photoshop or Paint and move one of the rectangles, cut it out and slide it over to the other one, you'll find that those are actually the same shades of gray. This is an optical illusion, but it's a very effective optical illusion. The contrast that we see is relative to its environment. It's relative to its surroundings. The reason that you think the left rectangles are a darker shade of gray is because they're surrounded by white to the left and to the right. And your eyes are comparing that to the white, and so you perceive it as darker. Okay, the same shade of gray surrounded to the left and the right by black in the very next line down now appears lighter. Okay, that's just the way your eyes work. Those are the same shades of gray. Okay, but contrast is important. We can't identify anatomical structures unless they're a different color gray than what's surrounding them. Okay, so these are contrast comparisons. We have a low contrast, that is, there's lots of, it's a longer grayscale, there's lots more shades of gray, but the differences between shades of gray is very, very subtle on the left. On the right, there's less available shades of gray in our grayscale. Things are either more black or white. Okay, you can do a quick experiment. Just try to count the individual colors in the left-hand image. Just look around the image. You can see what you would consider black, what you would consider white, and then there's an eggshell white, and then there's like a light gray, a dark gray, a medium gray. So on the left-hand pictures, there's about 7 or 8 different colors depending upon how your eyes work. In the right-hand picture, I would challenge you to find more than 5 different colors. And so the grayscale, we say the grayscale is truncated or shortened on the right-hand side image. That produces higher contrast. The difference between the dark colors and light colors is greater because there's less available options. You see? Okay. If you don't completely wrap your head around that, just keep listening to that and you'll get the hang of it. Okay. But go ahead, count the colors on the right. See if you come up with a number greater than 5. I don't think you will. I think it's either 4 or 5. I've done this before with the students in a live scenario, and we all typically agree that there's about 7 or 8 colors, individual colors that are unique on the left-hand side, about 4 or 5 colors on the right-hand side. All right, so here's a handy little table. Now, what is signal? Signal is the remnant beam strength. What's the remnant beam? That's the part of the beam that actually made it through the patient and is going to be captured by our image receptor. So mass, if you increase mass, you're going to get more remnant beam. However, your patient's going to get more dose. If you decrease mass, you're going to get less remnant beam, so you might not capture enough to create an image, but your patient's going to have less dose. So we got to find a balance with mass. You see, we got to give the patient enough dose that we can create an image, but no more than that, because excessive dose doesn't create a better image. Okay, KVP, you're going to get a stronger signal, so you're going to create an adequate image with more KVP, more penetration power. However, you're going to increase the amount of scatter radiation. The grid only cleans up so much. And so you're actually going to introduce more randomness into the image, and the image is going to start to look muddy or grainy. It's going to look like it's got random information in it. Okay. You ever tune to like a television channel that back in the old days you turn to a television channel that there was no one broadcasting on that, and you just got like the snow pattern? They call that white noise now. That's what increasing scatter does. It's introducing that noise type of quality. The more scatter you generate, the more that noise pattern starts manifesting embedded in your X-ray image. And so with enough of that noise, you don't really get a coherent, there's no coherent shapes. You start to lose the ability to identify the anatomy because there's too much distortion and randomness embedded in your image. Okay, so you can't have too much KVP. All right, so technique charts should be in every room and on mobile machines. Now, sometimes it's not a paper. In fact, most of the time anymore, it's not a paper technique chart. The technique chart in its modern iteration is the APR, which is what I talked to you guys about yesterday when I went over the control panel. I'll go over it again as we have our equipment manipulation lab. What is an APR? It's anatomically programmed radiography. You tell the X-ray machine what body part and what projection you're doing, and the X-ray machine recommends a technique to you. Okay? What KVP and what mass should you use? What SID will work for that? Should you use a grid or not? All of that would be stuff that we would include in a technique chart. Now in your senior year, I'll actually teach you the method for making a technique chart should you want to. Okay, it's required, but no one goes to because the APR exists. Most people just say, well, the APR is essentially a technique chart. Now, if the APR is not properly calibrated upon installation, well, then it's a worthless technique chart. And that's up to the department manager and whoever's purchasing the equipment from the manufacturer. Make sure as they're doing applications, they're actually testing the APR techniques on phantoms and demonstrating that, yes, in fact, these are diagnostic techniques and they don't overexpose the patient. So your primary factors, tube current, MA, exposure time in seconds, KVP. Are you using automatic exposure control? Now, I said I would not teach you that because it will confuse you. Well, I'm gonna tell you the quick version of it. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a sensor that automatically terminates the exposure. Okay. What kind of a sensor is it? It's a sensor of ionizing radiation. Okay. So we have this device. It's embedded in the image receptor in the Bucky trays, right in front of the grids that are in the Bucky trays. We have these little sensors. We call them AECs. When they get hit by a certain threshold of radiation, a certain number of photons, they're going to activate and they're going to kill the exposure switch, and so the X-ray machine is going to shut off and it's not going to expose anymore. Okay, pretty straightforward. A deeper dive, yeah, your senior year, that's when you go into a deeper dive. You can read about that in Buchong if you're just curious, but But really, you really don't need to know more about AEC until you're almost ready to pass the registry. If you understand that it's an automatic kill switch for the exposure that's based on a radiation sensor in the image receptor apparatus, that's all you need to know for practical applications and performing exams. SID, I introduced that term to you the other day. That's called source to image receptor distance. We are going to wear out the term SID in the procedures class. Okay, typically it's standardized to 40 or 72 inches. And remember, increased SID is inversely proportional to intensity. It's actually inversely proportional to the square, or the square root of the intensity going that way. It's called the inverse square law, because as distance increases, the intensity reduces by the square of the inverse of the distance. Okay, I will run through the mathematics of that with you in physics class. The grid is a filter, but it does require more mass because it does inadvertently absorb some of the primary photons. Its job is to absorb scatter photons that are heading off in random directions. Electrical supply, we'll get into that in physics, but there's different types of generators for X-ray machines. So different types of electrical supplies for X-ray machines. Okay. Part thickness and part composition. Okay. Part thickness should be measured with calipers. Calipers are special rulers to determine the thickness of the body part. You don't see a lot of techs using calipers, but techniques would be more consistent if they were based on, more closely based on part thickness measurements. In addition to that, part composition and tissue type, which is related to tissue density, that also matters, and you have to change your technique. For example, the neck and the knee are roughly the same diameter and circumference. So go ahead, put your hands around your knee, right? And notice that your hands, your thumb and your middle finger can touch, and you can completely circumscribe your knee, or it's really, really close. And then do the same thing for your neck, and then you notice that the size of your knee and the size of your neck are almost exactly the same. So you could use the same technique, right? Wrong. The knee is 90% bone, right? And then there's some muscle and connective tissue. The neck is probably about 60-40 ratio, 60% muscle, 40% bone. Okay, and then there's cartilage and connective tissue, right? But the ratio of bone to muscle or bone to soft tissue is very, very different for the neck and the knee. And therefore, you typically need just a little bit more kV for the knee than you do for the neck. Okay. The lungs, the chest, and the thorax are often about the same part thickness, but the thorax is easier to penetrate because it's primarily filled with air. So that's another example where part composition extremely affects what techniques we set. So certain pathologic conditions, you're going to get this repeated in the pathology course, but certain pathologies thin the tissues out from their regular structures. So pneumothorax creates thinner tissue because it collapses the lung. Emphysema, overinflated alveoli, and hyperinflated lungs means that the air to parenchymal tissue ratio, there's actually more air in an emphysemic lung than there is a healthy lung. Okay. Emaciation, that's thinning as a result of starving yourself. Okay. Degenerative arthritis, that is mineral redistribution. So you actually rob the spongy bone from the epiphysis of your long bones in order to populate bone spurs at the edges of the joints. Okay, so it's said to be degenerative because the spongy bone degenerates in order to grow the bone spurs. And then atrophy, similar to emaciation, atrophy is just the muscle. It's typically describing muscles. Muscles lose size when they're not used as much. Muscles increase in size. That's called hypertrophy when they are utilized and exercised. And we saw that with the picture that's still, I still am tripping over that guy that was just watching in the background. It was just kind of, it was weird. All right. Certain pathologies actually result in increased tissue density. Pneumonia, we draw fluid into the lung, so the air is replaced by fluid. Pleural effusion, same thing. Hydrocephalus, more fluid on the brain. Enlarged heart, more fluid. Edema, soft tissue swelling, okay, by extra fluid. And then ascites, gathering fluid to the peritoneal cavity. So when fluid rushes into tissue, that fluid absorbs more x-rays than if the tissue didn't have swelling and inflammation going on. And so all of these draw fluid to the tissue that normally wouldn't have that volume of fluid, and so that fluid absorbs extra x-rays. And so you need to increase penetration power when you're dealing with these type of situations. So increase kV. Right? Optimal kV is not as essential to image quality. Slightly higher kV yields better image than slightly lower kV. So when you're in doubt, increase kV because it's going to increase penetration. You'll slightly increase scatter, but we have good tools, both the grids and now the softwares are correcting for deposition of scatter on the image receptor. So we can actually reduce and eliminate a lot of the scatter that deposits in the raw data. Okay. And before it becomes the final displayed image, we can reduce some of that randomness in the image. Okay? Part centering is essential for the image reader to work optimally. Yes, especially with CR, you have to center the field to the cassette that you're using and only shoot one exposure per cassette, because if you shoot multiple, well, that affects the image analysis software, and so you can actually create an error that doesn't occur if you only shoot one-on-one. Okay, so always remember that the X-ray image becomes, as soon as the exposure is over, it's a data set. It's no longer X-ray photons. It's a set of data. Okay, it is pixel intensities. Those pixel intensities are processed and slightly modified and then ultimately displayed. All right, but it's a data set. As soon as the exposure is over, the image is a data set. All right, so signal to noise ratio. Now, most people don't listen to music stations anymore, but we have a classic rock station here in Nashville. It's called the Rocket 105.9. And a lot of people like to drive out to the UT football game out in Knoxville. Now, my question for you is, can you listen to the Rocket 105.9? Can you listen to the Eagles and 20 other songs from the 70s all the way to Knoxville? And the answer is no. And why do you think that is? Well, it's signal to noise ratio. See, your radio is actually catching a wave being broadcast from a radio tower in Nashville. So that top right-hand picture, That's like the useful X-ray beam or the radio signal that you're trying to tune into, okay? Um, so when that is very, very amplified relative to the noise, the software can say, oh, this is actually what we're looking for. All this other stuff is just garbage. We can ignore it. Okay? It's kind of like when the lumberjacks go looking for the Rockefeller Christmas tree, right? They go up into the Catskills with their chainsaws and their big truck, right? And they start walking around until all of a sudden they go, oh my God, because there's this gigantic 60 to 80 foot Douglas fir just sitting there. And they're like, yeah, this is the one, clearly. You know, why wasn't it any of the other ones? Because that wasn't the signal. That wasn't the one that stood out amongst all those other scrub pine trees. That's the noise. The Rockefeller Christmas tree, that's the one that you can't help but stare at it. That's how big that pine tree is, okay? That's what we want our image receptor to say about our X-ray beam. We want there to be weak amounts of noise in very, very tiny quantities, but the intended primary beam is 4 to 5 times stronger in amplitude than that random noise. And so it clearly can tell the difference. That's what we mean by a signal to noise ratio. You typically want a signal to noise, the signal to be 5 to 6 times greater in amplitude than the noise. Now, what happens when you get to Crossville and you're rocking out to the Eagles? All of a sudden you get in between the lyrics, right? And it's just as Glenn Frey is about to hit this and Joe Walsh are about to hit this amazing guitar solo, and you get this, it's like, oh man, that was the best part of the song. Yeah, what happened? The signal, oh, remember inverse square law? Yeah, the radio signal is following the inverse square law too. So as you're driving away from the radio tower, the intensity of the radio signal is dropping. And then eventually it gets to the same size as all the background noise that your radio is picking up. And so your radio is trying to broadcast the wanted signal, but it can't tell the difference between that and all the noise. So it just broadcasts everything. And that's why you get the crackles on the radio when you drive too far away. All right, so how do we formulate techniques? What's going to be a good strategy for you as you first start setting techniques in the digital age? Well, we know that mass is equivalent to dose for our patients. But KVP is just penetration power. Yes, it increases scatter radiation, but we have methods to clean up the scatter radiation. So in general, high kV, low mass techniques are going to be optimal. We're going to get an image with the least amount of dose to our patients. Okay? The other nice thing about digital technology, remember how we can adjust brightness and contrast now? You can use anywhere from 75% of recommended strength of signal all the way up to, I think, 300 times what you need, and you'll still get a diagnostic image. Okay? It might, well, 300 might be, it might be more like 6 times what you need to get a diagnosis. And 300 might be the saturation point. You don't want to go to the saturation point. Bad things happen at the saturation point. Okay? KVP still governs adequate penetration. So if you're underpenetrated, you're going to get a white silhouette. That's a clear sign that you're underpenetrated. Okay? If you don't have enough mass, then you're going to get quantum model. Quantum model is pixels that didn't, random pixels in your image matrix didn't receive any photons at all, and so they don't know what to broadcast. Okay? So we do need to send enough photons so that each pixel gets a couple hundred photons. Exposure indicators. So with digital technology, now we have like a strength readout for your remnant beam. The manufacturer calls that the exposure indicator. The exposure indicator tells the technologist how much exposure was delivered to the image receptor on a number scale that tells you what the manufacturer considers optimal. For example, Kodak CR, the number scale, the recommended number scale is 1800 to 2200. So an average of 2000 plus or minus 200. Right? So every time you make an exposure on a Kodak CR, you could look up the exposure indicator and it'll say like 1600. Well, the manufacturer says you're too low. You should have used more technique, either more kV, slightly more kV, or slightly more mass to get above 1800, but not so fast. Is it diagnostic? Because you can actually come in under what's recommended and still get a diagnostic image. Remember, we can go as much as 75% of what the manufacturer recommends, and we still don't see the appearance of model. It's when you get down to nearer to 50% of what the manufacturer recommends, that's when you start to get a modeled appearance to your image. Okay? So, what about overexposure? Well, your software can actually rescale all your pixel intensities. It's like, let's say it's expecting numbers between 50 and 100 photons per pixel, but you sent it 150 to 300 photons per pixel. Well, it's not expecting that. But if I divide that range by 3, what do I get? Oh, 50 to 100. How about that? So that's what it does. If you turn in a data set where all the values about 3 times too high over what the software was expecting, it just divides all your intensities by 3 and then it processes it. It's a software subroutine called automatic rescaling. Now, the problem with that is text can go around overexposing up to 6 times more radiation than they actually need, and there's no visual indicator. The image doesn't get darker anymore when you overexpose. Okay? In fact, for some softwares, the image actually gets lighter. Okay? So it's really, really tricky to, unless you're looking up your exposure indicators and keeping track of them, you really don't know as a modern radiographer if you're overexposing your patients or not. Okay? Now steps are being taken to educate technologists, and we make it a point to keep reinforcing what are exposure indices for and why do we have them. Okay? More than ever, minimizing public exposure to medical radiation has become the primary benefit of requiring professional certification for radiographers. Exposure indicators do not report patient dose. They report how strong is your remnant beam. Now, if your remnant beam is stronger than what was recommended, let's say you shot, remember Kodak CR 1800 to 2200. Let's say you did an exposure. God bless. Hang on. Sorry about that. Nationwide emergency alert system test. I think I saw that was going to happen on Twitter. So now you know when I'm recording this. It's October 4th at about 1:15 p.m. because your phone just did the same thing. Okay? So exposure indicators are not related to brightness and contrast. all the exposure indicator tells you is how strong is your remnant beam single strength. Now, if your manufacturer recommends 2200, but you shot an exposure that's over that number, like 2400, well then clearly you overexposed your patient because you used more than the top end of what was recommended by the manufacturer. Okay, so insufficient techniques result in low exposure indicators can cause model noise, which is it presents the same way as scatter, but it's just a different root cause. Okay, so you get randomness starting to creep into your image with insufficient technique. Okay, high exposure indicators represent that you could have used a lower exposure and therefore you have overdosed your patient. Okay, to achieve exposure indicators in the recommended range, use high kV, low mass techniques as a general practice. Now, what is the specific kV and what's the specific mass? Well, that's going to change from body part to body part and projection to projection. Okay, but in general, high kV, low mass. All right. Now, this is actually not from Bushong. This is from the Carroll book. How is the exposure indicator calculated? It's usually the midpoint of what's considered the actual anatomic exposures. And this picture is called a histogram. And the middle peak, the far right peak, is always prosthetic, bright white metallic object. That's over at C. Okay. Over at B, that's all raw primary radiation. That's jet black. In the middle is the in-between colors between metal content, C, bright white, and raw primary radiation, jet black, at B. Anatomy usually doesn't present as completely pure white or completely pure black. And so your anatomic range, your useful peak, is in the middle of the two peaks, and that's how you read the histogram. The midpoint value, that's typically the exposure indicator. Okay. Now, if you don't understand any of that, I'm going to spend a whole chapter on histogram analysis and digital imaging in the spring of your senior year. All right, so that was a quick representation. What's your takeaways? I want you to understand KVP is penetration power, mass is the number of photons. Okay. We used to talk about buckets of paint and throwing paint against a wall. So chucking paint against a wall, paint from a bucket. How much paint do you have in the bucket? Well, that's the mass. How hard are you chucking it? That's the KVP. Or the shotgun shell analogy, that works too. Okay? Part thickness, part composition, and presence of pathology has an effect on technique. You'll have to adjust. So techniques are usually set for average size adults. So you have to reduce the technique if the body part is smaller than average, like children. Okay? Or if you're adult, we'll get into the habituses, that is the overall size of the patient. You might notice that construction workers and lumberjacks and people who do physical labor for a living, they're a little bit thicker and beefier around the shoulders than most folks. Okay? And so those changes in body habitus, those are what we call hypersthenic individuals. Okay? Arnold Schwarzenegger, in his prime, was a hypersthenic. He was an extreme hypersthenic individual. But most of your physical labor people that are actually lifting heavy things routinely or doing tasks that involves strenuous physical activity, yeah, they've got a little bit more muscle mass than the rest of us. You see this also with professional athletes. Um, those folks are also hypersthenic. And so you got to increase your technique for the increased amount of muscles stacked on top of their skeletons than most people have. Okay? All right. Those are the key takeaways. We're going to reinforce this. We're going to keep coming back to this. This is meant to be just a brief overview. We'll dive deeper later. Mr. Shepard will dive really deep next summer. I'll retouch on it in digital imaging class, and we'll definitely go back over it in register review class. All right. So you'll have constant reinforcement of this stuff. This is just so that you're just not wandering around blind when people talk about KVP and mass. All right. All right. I'll see you guys in class. Take care.